right, chapter 5 is your environmental ecosystems and ecosystem ecology. We're going to start looking at feedback loops in this particular unit. So feedback loops are actually the opposite of what they would seem. A negative feedback loop is actually good and reverse the results of creating stability. Like when you're too hot or you're too cold, your body wants to sweat or shiver to get back to the ideal temperature. That's a negative feedback loop. The image is a positive feedback loop over here, which is actually a bad scenario. This occurs with global warming. So normally our glaciers, they actually reflect back some of the heat from the sun, which keeps the planet at a good temperature. We call this albedo. Unfortunately, the darker areas in the ocean, those absorb more heat right in here, and that's going to cause the ice within them to melt. And then when that happens, more dark areas are present, which absorb more heat, which melts more ice, and so on and so forth. So positive feedback loops actually enhance the bad effects. And those are things like erosion or cancer, human population growth. Once the population starts to get bigger, you're going to then have more individuals reproducing. So it's going to continue to get bigger. So make sure you know the definitions of the following: the runoff, watershed, airsheds. This is the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we know after mapping all the watersheds in our country, where the water that runs off from cities and farms and all those other locations, where it's actually going to end up. We know what rivers and what streams it feeds into, and they've done this in the Chesapeake Bay area. What we also have found is the dissolved oxygen levels then that fish need in order to survive. So dissolved oxygen is all the oxygen that's found concentrated within the water. Ideally, concentrations that are above a 3 milligrams per liter or parts per million, it's about the same, is the average amount of what a fish would need in a particular environment. If that gets lower, there's not enough oxygen found present in that water, and the fish will start to die off. When that happens, we look at something called eutrophication. So this is an extremely important topic to understand. It comes back over and over and over again, many different places. So please review the steps that are within this picture, and I'm going to summarize them right now. So with farms that use fertilizer or manure, it rains outside, or even urban sewage systems that get distributed directly into a water source. All of that fertilizer, manure, and sewage has nitrogen and phosphorus in it. As that gets run off, it gets sent into water systems if it's not absorbed by plants that the farmer is spreading it on. So excess nutrients from the rain runs off into the rivers and the lakes, and then eventually into oceans. This can cause phytoplankton or algae to bloom, because remember, plants want phosphorus and nitrogen. It's actually a good thing for them. So they start to bloom, they get really excited, they reproduce very quickly, and they call that an algal bloom. That algae then, some will actually die because it'll run out of nutrients, and you start to see other organisms within that lake starting to die as well, because all of the algae on the surface is actually blocking the sun out. They can't do photosynthesis. So stuff on the bottom will start to die, stuff on the surface starts to die, and all of that stuff then needs to be decomposed. So the decomposers found within the lake or the ocean start to go crazy, breaking down all of that matter. When they do that, they start to use all of the dissolved oxygen located within the water system. That starts to cause a drop in oxygen levels, which makes a hypoxic environment, one without oxygen, and we call that a dead zone at that point. Fish cannot survive and other organisms can't survive. So if you look at the Chesapeake Bay, over here in this image, the orange is actually locations where the dissolved oxygen levels are so low that no survival can actually occur in this area. We've seen this in the Gulf of Mexico as well. It's important to study this because you will see it again and again and again throughout this course. Make sure you take a look at the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the hydrosphere, and those are review from freshman biology class. Remember, atmosphere is all the gases above us. Biosphere is the earth. Hydro is the water. Litho is the actual like rocks and soil and everything else. Also known as the geosphere. So, gross primary production is energy made by autotrophs or producers in an ecosystem. 90% is lost as heat. 10% is actually used to create body tissues for consumers. And remember, that's the rule of 10. This is productivity, or the rate at which energy is converted into biomass. So how much you're actually using to produce the extra cells that you need and muscles and everything else. Another way of saying this, if you think about it, is net primary productivity. That's the energy available to consumers, which is 10% on average. So on land, the biomes that are the hottest and the wettest have the highest net primary productivity. That'd be your rainforest. They have the most productivity around. They have a high amount of photosynthesis occurring, and therefore their net productivity is a lot higher. In the oceans, the more light nutrients that we have, the more net primary productivity. And those nutrients come from upwelling. So let's take a look at upwelling here. And so here's your map of your net primary productivity. The image shows the highest and lowest ecosystems with net primary productivity. So if you look at the figure, the open ocean has a very little upwelling, so there's not much that actually lives out in the middle of the ocean. If you look towards the coasts, that's where you start to see upwelling occurring and more net primary productivity, because that's where the plants can reach the surface better and do more photosynthesis. There are places that have a lot of productivity, like the rainforest. And then obviously the ocean is in purple, so it's lacking nutrients. So these nutrients are limiting factors in our ecosystem, because if you have to start your producers, or if you can't start producers, you're not going to then be able to feed consumers and so on and so forth. So if the producers run out of nitrogen and phosphorus, they can't grow, the animals can't eat them, and so on and so forth. The food chain actually collapses. So this is what these areas tend to run out of first. The ocean actually runs out of nitrates. Freshwater areas run out of phosphates first. And the land itself usually runs out of phosphates because erosion is required to produce more phosphates to replenish that within the system. So we are going to then take a look at the dead zone map. And again, I told you big dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a very large dead zone. And that's again because of all the farmlands feeding into by runoff to the Mississippi River, which then spills out into that location. Most rich areas have dead zones, rich countries, and that's due to the fact that we can afford more fertilizers for crops. And we also are able to eat more meat, which creates more manure for runoff. So the larger, wealthier countries are the countries where you see the most zones, dead zones within their water systems. Ecotones are important to understand, just the area between boundaries. We call those ecotones. Okay. And then, ecosystem goods and services. It's important to understand what our ecosystem is giving to us as goods and services. This is stuff that the environment is going to provide for us that gives us economic or survivor skills and tasks. So be able to make money on several things like logs and paper products, or just the survival of having land to produce food on. If we take a look at the list right here, the AP test, you might have to give examples of this. So you would need to describe the entire statement in order to get the full points, not just list it. So control crop pests with predators and parasites, or the environment prevents soil erosion with plants. There's a bunch of different lists here, and there's also this really nice image up here that actually shows more of our ecosystem services and goods. So bees give us the service of pollinating our plants. The marsh here filters water before it goes into the rest of the lake. Got a bunch of different things that are super important. Purifying air with trees. They also give us the paper. They give us the aesthetic value of being able to look at their beauty and hike through. So there's more to it than just the monetary value of things. We're going to come back and we're going to then take a look at the biogeochemical cycles.